And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brad Birzer. Brad Birzer, when I first met Brad, he was recommended to me. He spoke for us at first time in 1995. He was still a grad student. He had no gray hair at that point. And I did not know that in 1995 we'd be beginning a relationship that would carry on this way for so long. We have had the wonderful pleasure of having Brad give hundreds of lectures in our programs for teachers and students. He's also a member of our Board of Trustees, and he's chairman of our Academic Advisory Board. He holds the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in History at Hillsdale College and is a fellow of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. Brad is the author of 7 books, including In Defense of Andrew Jackson, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, and J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth. Brad has also authored some 650 essays for our online journal. So we said earlier there's 6,800, almost 10% of them written by Brad Birzer over the last 9 years. So he's been very committed to our outreach online. And so it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, the friend of this institute, Dr. Brad Birzer.
Good morning, everybody. Such a great treat to be here. I left Michigan yesterday, late afternoon. I had 2 classes yesterday morning, and I wanted to teach. And when I left, it was raining and about 53 degrees. So, but yet when I landed in Houston last night, it was pretty nice. So, it was great. Anyway, thank you so much for all of this. I want to thank Winston for that very, very gracious introduction. And it is amazing to me when I look back at my own career. I'm 52 now. And I have been at Hillsdale College for 20 years, but I've been affiliated with the Free Enterprise Institute for 24. These are my 2 great institutional loves. So, and I calculated quickly in my head, we have this online journal that reaches anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people a day. And in that online journal, I've written almost 1 million words over the last 9 years. I think that's a disease, but it's a good one to have, so I'm very, very glad to be here. I really can't imagine my career or my profession or any of my works at all without Winston and the Free Enterprise Institute. So I want to begin by thanking the Free Enterprise Institute and Winston and Steve and Eileen and LaDawn and Connor for everything they've done. It's great to be a part of this, and I can say that in the other travels that I've had, Winston mentioned that we have this following in Romania. We also have followings, I think he mentioned, in Brazil, in Denmark, and in Poland, which is pretty amazing. I mean, there's actually a school of thought in Denmark called the Imaginative Conservative that's named after Winston's website. That's pretty stunning to think about that. And we're rivaling now National Review and some of the other big conservative publications. Well, today I want to talk about the second of 3 great figures. So Joseph brilliantly talked about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who of course was our great prophet of the era. We also had a great priest, John Paul II, and I would like to talk about the third, the great king, Ronald Reagan. And I use these terms not lightly. I really do believe that in 1989 we were given a priest, a prophet, and a king. Never could we have all 3 offices in one. That can only happen twice, right? Once with Melchizedek and once with Christ. But we're not going to have that again, but we can see those offices distributed in a variety of different ways. And when I think about someone like Ronald Reagan, our 40th president of the United States, president from 1981 to 1989, I am always reminded of what it means to be an American. I was in 7th grade when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and I was a senior in college when the wall came down. I was very much a child of the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan was always my hero. I will never, ever forget the kind of heroism that he inspired, not only for me, but my friends as well. We all recognized that we were living in the midst of greatness. We knew that. And of course, Reagan carried that off so beautifully, not because he thought he was great, but because he thought he had purpose. And what a difference. Right? Not someone who was full of himself, but someone who realized that he should make others full of themselves in the sense of actually working towards some goal. So when I think of the best of America, I think of liberty, I think of thoughtfulness, but I also think of this great character that Ronald Reagan had, and yet he did it with humility. He had audacity, this audacity to challenge what was wrong. So much of what Winston just talked about from the Meno and from what we saw with Socrates. Do we challenge what is wrong? Do we live with Socrates and say that we are willing to hate what ought to be hated and to love what ought to be loved? One of my favorite writers, Russell Kirk, tried to describe Ronald Reagan this way. He said, for all of his power of will, Ronald Reagan has been honored lately. He wrote this in 1981, just right before Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. He has had already the audacity to declare that this American republic will endure and thrive. He has been sufficiently bold to set his face against the prophets of decay. And with the old Roman republicans, he knows that audacity is a bulwark and that fortune both fears and favors the audacious. The American Republic commenced with audacity. If that audacity is exhausted, the Republic must end. Ronald Reagan, the audacious American stage manager just now, is not disposed to let fall that iron curtain of national destiny. For him, the American drama is not yet played out. Now, I'd like to take us back to 1980 and 1981 and try and remember, for those of us in the room who were there at the time, how utterly depressing the years of the late 1970s were. We had stagflation. We had just left and betrayed Vietnam and Cambodia, and also had left, by the way, Laos as well. We had been promised that containment against the Soviet Union would work, and yet during the 1970s, communism spread into Mozambique, into Angola, into Afghanistan, into Nicaragua, into Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. So everything that we'd been promised in the 1950s and the 1960s was completely falling apart. And then you can imagine, we get to the very late 1970s, and we have the Iranian Revolution, and of course, the takeover of the embassy there and the taking of our hostages. This was a terrible time. In every way, this was a terrible time. National morale was at one of the lowest points that it had ever been at. And yet, when Ronald Reagan came forth, as Russell Kirk said, with this audacity, he said something that was profoundly true and yet as simple as can be. The only thing necessary for hope is hope. This is what hope is, right? This is what matters. And Reagan gave us that hope. And that hope is what I want to talk about today, that beauty that Reagan was able to impart to the American people. Now, when he came into office in January of 1981, there was a long background there to his own thoughtfulness. This was a man, and we've been able to prove this over and over again since his passing, and now that his notes have become available, not just his 4x5, but his 3x5, his 4x6, his 3x5 cards. We've been able to now translate his shorthand. We have diaries, we have letters from Ronald Reagan. They are immense in every way, and they are detailed, and we know that this is a man who read constantly. This is a man who thought constantly. Remember when we were told he was just an amiable dunce? It was the people reporting that who were the dunces, and I'm not sure they were too amiable. Reagan was brilliant in his own way, and he understood exactly what he needed to get done and what America needed to get done. We know that as early as 1963, he had already outlined in his private notes a way to bring down the Soviet Union without war. And he kept honing those notes. He wasn't even governor of California yet when Reagan was sitting around playing fantasy Cold War. And he's writing down in these notes, how do we go about doing this? How can we pressure them? And his argument was a very simple and yet profound argument. The Soviet Union, by its very internal logic, is so anti-humane that its days are already numbered. Now, can you imagine saying that in 1963? Or even in 1981, when Reagan did say that, and he was mocked, he was ridiculed for saying something that was seemingly so foolish, and yet Reagan understood. He said, any time that we Americans unleash our creativity, we will defeat the Soviets at every level. This is not a struggle of one materialism against another materialism. This is the struggle for the human spirit, Reagan said. The Soviets have done nothing but crush that human spirit We Americans from day one have done our best to enliven the American spirit. We're the first country in the Western world to go against slavery. We were the first country to declare all people being created equal. All of these things Reagan said were innovations, and yet they were innovations towards what was good and true and beautiful. And then we see Reagan in 1977, where he's meeting with his advisor, Dick Allen, and they are talking about strategy, how to win the Cold War. Reagan, of course, had just lost the nomination for the Republican presidential candidacy, and it would be not until 1980 that he would actually be able to run again. But when Dick Allen asked Reagan, well, what's your theory on the Soviet Union? He said, my theory is this, Dick. The Cold War is that we will win and they will lose. What do you think about that, Dick? That's pretty amazing, right? We'll win, they lose. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, in 1980, Ronald Reagan, of course, comes to the presidency, takes the oath of office in early January of 1981, and what happens within the first 2 months of his presidency, which really wasn't going that well in the first 2 months. Reagan was doing everything possible, scrambling to get everything put together in his administration. Of course, we have a young crazy man, John Hinckley, who does everything possible to assassinate the president and comes very, very, very close. And I still remember very clearly in 7th grade when the principal of Liberty Junior High in Hutchinson, Kansas, came over the intercom and announced that President Reagan had been assassinated. He was dead. We found out later, of course, that was not the case, but that was the word that went out across America. We now know that Reagan, the moment that he recovered, and he had a very quick recovery, the man was in incredible shape despite the brutality of that bullet. He wrote in his diary right after his recovery, whatever happens now, I owe my life to God, and I will do everything to serve him in every way that I can. That was not an empty promise by any means. And I had the great privilege, I mentioned to you earlier that I've said twice now, that I was in 7th grade when Ronald Reagan came to the presidency. My oldest brother, Kevin, graduated from the University of Notre Dame that spring. So he was 22 at the time. He was graduating, and Ronald Reagan was asked to give the graduation address. March 17th, 1981. This was the very first time Reagan had appeared in public and had given a public address after the assassination attempt. I remember, even as a kid, seeing him on stage. He looked huge. Later, I found out because he was wearing full body armor in his chest, and obviously, that was one reason he looked so great. But any of you who've studied Reagan, and I don't mean to make this sound inappropriate, but Reagan worked out so much after the bullet that from ages 71 to 73, he added 2 inches of muscle to his chest. That's pretty good. I'm not sure I can do that at 52. Let's hope I can do that at 71. So anyway, Reagan was incredible about this. And the speech that he gave, and I will never forget it, this was one of the great kind of political moments of my life. The speech that he gave was a tour de force in which he told us, and I will only read 2 quotes from it, but he told us exactly what does it mean to have hope. And this is what he said. He said, we need you. We need your youth. We need your strength. We need your idealism to help make all that is right, that is wrong. Now, I know that at this period in your life, you have been and are critically thinking about the mores and customs of the past, and you're questioning their values. Every generation does this. But may I suggest that you don't discard the time-tested values upon which civilization was built simply because they are old. It's good advice. And then he says, I promise you, now remember, 1981, the years ahead are great ones for this country, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce it. It will dismiss it as some bizarre aberration and chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. Well, that was Reagan's very first pronouncement against the Soviet Union during his presidency. And those were powerful 10 words that changed the foreign policy of America, because up to that point, everything that the United States had done against the Soviets from 1946 forward had been materialist containment against materialist containment. And Reagan identified exactly what needed to be done. we must challenge them not at the level of material things, but at the spiritual level. We must show them that we have a God, that we have law, and that our society is based on creativity, goodness, truth, and beauty. And I'm not going to tell the story. Barbara Elliott can tell this story so beautifully, and I will let her tell the story. But I can't end without us thanking God for Ronald Reagan, one of, I think, the three greatest presidents that we have had in American history. He was absolutely the right man at the right time, who did the right thing when the right thing absolutely needed to be done, but was not easy to do at all. Reagan was that great figure. I want to thank you all for having me speak today. I want to thank you all for supporting the Free Enterprise Institute, for supporting Winston and ideas that we have here, like those of Ronald Reagan. And I would now like to turn it over to Barbara Elliott, who will give our final, or to Steve. Thank you.